I'd like to open up the City Council meeting, Monday, May 20th, 5 o'clock, special meeting. And I don't have anything else here, so I will have to hand it over to whomever.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Gramonte, council members. So we are having a study session tonight. This is, we talked at budget about the about the city's reserve policy. And so tonight is kind of just a education, talk through some different options, get some initial feedback, and then we'll come back with a full drafted reserve policy for your formal action. One of the kind of numerous best practices that we're going to be working on, one is to update the reserve policy, but there are other financial policies that we need to update, budget practices, et cetera, and those are also some of what's in the finance work plan for the next year. So Sue Casey, our Assistant City Manager, oversees finances here, and we'd like to kind of just walk you through what the current policy is and some options and get some feedback. So what I'd recommend, Mayor Gramonte, is we do the presentation first, take some questions from council, then go out and do public comment, and then come back and, get some feedback from the council. Okay. So with that, I'll turn to Sue.
Good evening, Mayor Gramonte and City Council members. Where's my... So the City of Sonoma financial reserve policies, they were established for several reasons, and the policies guide the city in planning for economic uncertainties, downturns in the economy, or natural or local disasters or catastrophic events like the fire, maintain good standing with credit rating agencies, future debt or capital obligations, ensuring cash availability when revenue is unavailable, and then deciding when to use reserves and how to replenish reserves if they have been spent. And so the workshop tonight is to discuss several proposed changes and additions to the current city's financial reserve policy. And as we go through the slides, the changes to the current policy are highlighted in red, and we'll discuss them in detail as we go along. So the City of Sonoma's reserve policy was last updated by the City Council in 2006. In February 2009, the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB, issued a statement number 54, which was fund balance reporting and government fund type definitions. And the objectives of the statement were to improve the usefulness, including understandability of governmental fund types and balance information. And it was to provide more clearly defined categories to make the constraints placed on government fund balances more transparent. It improved the comparability of government fund financial statements so that when you looked across cities, they would all have the same categories. And it helped financial statement users better understand the purposes for which each of the funds are established. And GASB 54 doesn't impact the amount or overall calculation of fund balances. It just changes the way it's reported on financial statements. So there's 5 categories, and the first is non-spendable, and that's funds that can't be readily converted to cash or is not legally spendable. And that example would be like assets required to be remained intact. Restricted is externally imposed restrictions on spending, say by grantors, granting agencies, laws, or creditors. And then we have committed, and that is City Council formally imposed restrictions on spending, and that's by resolution or other action. And then we have assigned fund balance, which is the funds reserved by the City Council, direction, or city manager designated purposes, and then unassigned. And that's a residual balance not classified in any of the above categories.
And maybe just one thing, as Sue looks at that. So really one of the things we need to do within this policy is we need to take our reserve policies, like our emergency reserve and these different policies, and we'll need to kind of put them in a bucket and be clear, okay, is this a committed, is this assigned? And so we can still have our reserve policies named, our own names, but we will be putting this additional layer of information on top of it.
And in the budget this year, we also categorized all the different fund balances based on this GASB. So when you looked at the reserve summary in the budget, it also categorized them that way. So the city has maintained 3 separate reserves for the general fund: the emergency reserve, the operating reserve, and the special projects fund reserve. And again, staff is proposing several updates and changes to these policies. And the changes will be highlighted in red, and we'll discuss those changes. The GFOA recommends a best practice for emergency fund reserves, and the level of reserves is really should be assessed on a city's unique circumstances or risk levels. But the best recommended best practice is to keep at least 2 months of operating expenditures or revenues in reserve, and they suggest at least 15% of reserves. So the purpose of our emergency reserve is to provide operating and or repair funds in the event of a local disaster or catastrophic event. And so every year when we adopt the budget, the City of Sonoma should establish a general fund emergency reserve of 17%. And that is actually 2 months of expenditures based on our budget. And
As I found out through the years, it doesn't have to be at 17%. It's a decision that's made by the council, And, you know, and that's the thing that's very different, because we've never even reviewed it every year since, I mean, we started, I think, last year, but previously, the policy was to look at the reserves, look at this fund, and to make certain decisions, and it's never been done. I can't tell you how far back that is, possibly all the way to 2006.
Yeah, and one thing that, you know, the last 2 years, we've put the reserve information in the budget, which is, I think, a really important thing, because as you're making your annual budget decisions, you do need to know what's in your reserves, and also then to put the policy in the budget, because that is the framework. So that's, you know, kind of where we're headed going forward.
So one of the changes you'll see highlighted in red is we're saying that we would rather have it be a reserve of general fund expenditures, not revenues, and also that again this reserve will be categorized as committed by City Council. And so the process for use of the emergency reserve, we kind of just went through that. But from time to time, the City Council may authorize budget appropriations in the event of a catastrophe or some kind of a, event that would an emergency or a natural disaster, and it might reduce that level below 17%. And the way that the reserve policy currently reads is that it would require 4/5 of the council to approve, and we're actually recommending that the appropriation shall be made by a simple majority vote of the City Council, and I'll go through that a little bit later. But if the City Council does appropriate funds that would drop this reserve below the 17% in the next budget cycle, there should be a plan to bring it back up to the required reserve.
Sorry, the required reserve?
Of 17% or 15%, whatever the council decides.
But it was decided by a previous council at that time, in '06, what was required then, not necessarily what's required or even more now. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's correct. So what we're saying is, whatever policy you set it, whatever is the threshold the council sets a policy at, if you have to dip into that reserve, like we did this last year, then you want to have you want the policy to describe that within a certain amount of time, like a year, you may not be putting all the money back in, but you wanted to be developing a plan of how you're going to replenish it if you can't replenish it all at one time. So again, that's just kind of a best practice. Again, the threshold and what that limit is, Mayor Gramonte, is that's the policy question for council to decide, and we'll talk more about, again, whether that's 15% or 17%.
So the proposed changes to this policy are in the calculation. We want to shift the policy to use expenditures for the calculation instead of revenues, because the purpose of the emergency reserve is to ensure the city has 2 months of operating funds on hand if necessary, and therefore we feel like the calculation should be based on expenditures, not revenues. And the GFOA recommends you can use either expenditures or revenues. And we did a survey of quite a few cities, and they base their emergency reserves on expenditures. So, and then the second proposed change would be the council authority threshold. Currently, the policy requires 4/5 of the city council to authorize use of the funds. And again, we did a review of numerous other city policies, and that's not the normal precedent. And we believe that a majority of the City Council should be able to give this direction. And a couple of reasons: in a natural disaster, the city could face a limited number of council members present to authorize use of the funding. And but if you do want to have a higher threshold, you could. We would recommend that there may be tiers of authority.
So potentially what that means maybe is, if council wants to stay with 4/5, and again, that's a policy call, our recommendation would be keep it at 2/3, just like all the rest of your budgeting and authorization. But if you want to keep it 4/5, you might say, okay, up to, for example, 500,000 can be done by a majority. Anything over 500,000 requires 4/5. So you could also create kind of a lever on different authority levels. Might be another way to consider it as well.
So, go ahead.
What vote does it take to change it from 4/5? Is it 2/3?
The policy does not state.
So it would be 2/3 then? So basically 2/3 can change it to 2/3 at any time?
Well, the policy would be done by resolution, and your resolutions are done, typically it would be majority. So your
Right.
majority could change could change it.
So like in an emergency then, if, as long as you had a quorum and you could
You would
change
have to,
it.
but you'd have to notice to change the ordinance, you'd have to change the resolution, and so, again, in an emergency, you may not want to kind of go through some of those steps.
I see. Okay.
So, does anyone have any questions? So.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can we maybe there's a few more slides just on the emergency reserve, if Sue can finish, and then maybe we can talk about, ask any questions on this one? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
So, my question was, was this the original policy from 2006?
This is the policy from 2006, except where we kind of had marked it in red, and there were a few changes that we're recommending to the emergency reserve.
Okay, thank you.
And so the only other change this would be categorized in the financial statements as committed fund balance.
So overall, in terms of the general fund reserve, what staff is recommending is this, we move from calculating this on revenues to expenditures. This would be committed under GASB because you're making a policy decision about it. At this point, it's 17%. GFOA says you can go to 15%. I think for us, we'll talk a little more about the operating reserve. I think I'd like to really kind of get a sense and understand where council is on both of those items, because I do see them, they're separate, but they're also hooked together. So, it could be either 15 or 17, but as for this city, we do not have a lot of kind of extra cash flow and extra funding. I've worked in other cities where you could do an interfund loan from an enterprise fund, and we don't have some of that. So it is important that we have good reserves. We do have good reserves now, and it's something we should be proud of. But I think there's either 15 or 17, and then we can talk about the operating reserve, which is the next reserve, which is really about more economic uncertainty to deal with if we have a recession, and actually not if, when we have a recession, because we will, and what is the glide path, what's the runway we need in terms of the amount of time to move through that.
Okay. So the next policy is the general fund operating reserve, and its purpose is to provide sufficient cash flow or funding while providing time for the city to evaluate fiscal alternatives in events of financial hardships, economic downturns, et cetera, and or reductions in revenues. So currently, the policy reads that the city will establish and maintain a general fund operating reserve of $1.5 million. And just so you know, that's currently less than 10% of total expenditures, or about 1.5 months of operating expenditures currently. And it's just available as a temporary revenue source. And it's really used while an orderly financial plan for cost reduction or general fund service revenue enhancements can be developed. And again, this is operating reserve will also be classified as committed fund balance. And the way that this fund is used is a reserve is used. It helps us maintain current service levels while the management team evaluates affected revenues and programs, and they can collectively work on solutions that could involve reduced service levels, again, or other temporary remedies. And then the proposed financial plan is shared with all city staff. And then the recommendations for the proposed financial plan are presented to the City Council for review, discussion, and adoption at a public meeting. And then the policy currently reads that it would be, where did I go?
Come back one more.
Is that it?
Come back one more. I think that's where you.
Okay, sorry. So, and it's, right now it reads that it should have 4/5 approval, just as the other one did. We're suggesting that it only be approved by a simple majority vote of the council. However, the other one could be, because of the constrictions on if there was an emergency event, you may not be able to get 4/5 of the council. This one could be by 4/5 of the council, but you could also do the tiers of approval as well. So one of the changes we are recommending is possibly over time to increase the reserve from 1.5 to 2 million, as it only currently provides about 1.5 months of coverage, and it might take a little bit longer to come up with a policy or to bring, about reserve revenues that could help in the in the event of a fiscal emergency. So, but first, we really want to do a thorough financial review, long-range financial forecast, and really look at what happened during the last recession with the city's key revenue sources. And then we would come back with a reserve change to change it from 1.5 to 2 and how we would get there. So. And again, the 4/5 emergency reserve approval is up to council, but again, we could take it, if you wanted to take it in tiers, or leave the other one a simple majority and then have this one still be a 4/5 emergency, approval.
So just a little background, and some council members may have been kind of on a council during a recession, and a lot of times what happens is things start to slow and you really don't know how long, how deep, or what's going to happen. So a lot of times what occurs is, like the first year, cities may use their reserves to kind of backfill when revenues don't come in. And then all of a sudden, year 2, you're thinking, okay, now we're in this thing a little longer. And now you're looking out saying, okay, how can we reduce costs? Because revenues are not going to come in. And so then you really start to potentially be in a cost cutting mode. And yet you don't want to do that, I would argue, in a way that is kind of destroys your organization and destroys your customer service overnight. So you want to be able to kind of ease into that. Last agency I was in, we did a 2-year layoff plan. We did 2 years of reductions. There was a lot of community kind of work, but there was a plan, but it takes some time to put that together. And again, the reserves give you some of that time so that you're not doing whiplash on your organization. And you really are thoughtful about how you're going to kind of take it down when you have to, when your revenues don't come in. So again, that's why it's important for us to go back and really do some analysis of the recession, the last couple of recessions, which we haven't had a chance to do. And so whether it's 1.5, whether it's 2, I don't know what that magic number is. But with about an $18 million general fund, 1.5 may not be enough to give us some of the elasticity that you really want. So you're not having to make really hard decisions in a very short time frame. So that's kind of the line of logic behind it.
And again, this would be classified under GASB 54 as a committed fund balance. And the final reserve for the general fund is a special projects reserve fund. And it's to segregate surplus fund balance from recurring revenue sources so that surpluses can be appropriated only for non-recurring expenditures. And it creates a funding source for one-time projects such as capital improvement projects of any type, surveys, studies, and analysis of both operating and capital needs, updates of adopted plans like the general plan or specific general plan elements, facility master plans, housing opportunities and strategies, and temporary service programs. For example, limited duration code or traffic enhancement efforts. So the one change we're making to this is that currently it's called the Special Projects Reserved Fund. And we want to change the classification to a Special Projects Reserve. And
that wording, does that lock? Is there a lock there?
So what it basically does is, right now the language talks about having a separate fund, and you wouldn't have it as a separate fund. You would just have it would just be designated within your general fund reserve. But the language in the policy talks about pulling it out and putting in a completely separate fund, and that's typically not the way you would do it. It all stays in your general reserve, but you are committing it, or you are assigning it in terms of a special project, but not setting up another fund, because it's far easier to really look at all your general fund when it's in one account, in one accounting fund.
Can I ask the question? So you've done that, and it's now in reserve. So does that mean, as I said, the word lock, does that mean if we wanted, I don't know, if someone else bought the property and we couldn't get access to it, we wanted to change the project, so what would that money, where would that money go? Now it's locked to do one thing, and that thing isn't available anymore. How do we get it out of that policy?
Like, for example, the splash funds. Let's say that, so whatever, there's two, just as a real world example, like how would that work?
Okay, so the splash funds are a little different. That's $250,000, and it actually was put in a separate fund. It's not in the general fund reserve. Now, it could be in the general fund reserve as assigned. It could be as a special project reserve, and have it be assigned to the splash project. Would be the same thing in accounting. Same kind of policy decision. You could, by resolution, change your mind on the special fund on the splash piece. You could also change your mind via resolution as you assign things within your general fund reserve. So you have flexibility as a council where things come up and maybe something that was done at one point makes sense, maybe it no longer makes sense, or maybe you want to shift priorities, whatever it, again, as things evolve. But it's really, there's not really a difference, but the splash is in a separate fund. So some of the other things you have assigned right now in your special projects reserve, for example, you have $500,000 that's assigned for the general plan. Okay, so you could decide that, all right, I am only going to assign $450,000. I'm going to pull $50,000 and go do X. Again, the majority council decides. So it's really, it's a policy decision, but it's not locked to a point that you can't change it, Mayor Gramonte, if that makes sense.
I guess my question would be why the council had reserve and fund different. Is there anything with interest in those as far as collecting
No.
more?
And usually, like for accounting standards, unless a financial resource is required to be accounted for in a different fund, which means that it has a special funding, like a special grant, or somebody we get special funds for it. It really should be accounted for in the general fund. Opening up different funds, there's a lot. There's a lot of accounting practices that you have to do to get it back into the general fund.
So to answer, I guess, Vice Mayor Harrington's question, let's talk about Splash. Where is that money right now?
So it's in a special fund, and it's.
But I mean, it's in its own checking account?
No, it's not in its own checking account. It's in its own fund. So it's accounted for. Funds are like checking accounts because they when we allocate interest out, say from lay for whatever, each of those funds receive their own amount of interest, but it's not a separate checking account. No.
So what's the wordsmithing? What's the difference between reserve instead of a fund?
A fund is actually like a separate. I mean, you could sort of think of it as a separate checking account, but it's accounted for separately. And the general fund accounts for everything that all other. I mean, the splash fund, and I'm not really sure where the funds. I don't know where the funds came from.
Was it general fund?
It just
it was
came
a general
from the
fund
general fund.
allocation.
So they said. So you could have just accounted for it in the general fund and called it assigned.
I think one thing that part of the transparency of updating this reserve policy is like you actually are saying, here's your reserve policy, and here's your reserves, and here's what you've assigned. And it's delineated. You can see it. And I think part of the reason historically people have put, or past councils have put it in a special fund is feeling like, okay, I really want to protect it. It's really not protected anymore because of than putting it, just assigning it within a general fund reserve. But I think there is kind of that perception of doing it that way, versus it can just be
Really
assigned.
a commitment.
Well, I guess my question is, what's the difference between assigned reserve or a fund? It sounds like we're going to change that, but what does that mean?
Well, this is all in general fund. These are all the classifications in general fund. You can actually have the same classifications in your water utility fund. You can have, and it's how they show up in your financial statements. You never see that splash fund on your financial statements because it's not considered a major fund. So we have quite a few smaller funds out there that are not reported in the financial statement because they're not major funds.
But I think the question is, are we talking about an accounting fiction or are we talking about a physical segregation of funds? And what you're talking about is an accounting, I'm calling it a fiction. But basically, we're saying, not a fiction like it's not real, but it is for accounting purposes only that we're calling it segregated. But in fact, it is held in one bank account, and we're talking about how we look at it for accounting purposes. And that's the question. Is when you talk about a fund, keeping it in one fund versus another fund, what you're talking about is how we keep the books, not how we physically keep the money. Is that correct?
Yes, but in your financial statements, the like all of the reserves will be much more transparent, or the committed funds, than having them in smaller funds that aren't part of your. I mean, all those smaller funds are grouped into one
It's just
category.
like,
You don't know what's out there.
but to simplify, just for my own mind, is what we're talking about is right now, if you have a splash fund, you can have like a one pager that says like, here's the splash fund, and then you can have a separate one pager that says, here's the blah 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 fund, and in the alternative, you could have one page that says, here's the assigned reserves. These are all the things that are in there, and that is a one pager about assigned funds. It's really just a way of thinking about the funds. It's not an actual it's not like the title of the funds. They aren't titled in a bank account like the splash fund. That's the difference between what we're talking about, right?
Well, there is a separate fund number like that the splash sits in. And so it is segmented
For
still
accounting purposes,
for accounting
not bank account
purposes.
purposes.
For accounting purposes. And the problem I think sometimes with a lot of smaller funds is, one, they can get forgotten, or what was the purpose and what was this for? And if council's looking at all of really what are your general investments that you've made, it's not as visible because it is segmented over here in the special fund. And maybe if you want to know, okay, well, let's take a look at all the places we have set aside general fund monies. And what do we want to do? And those things that were done over time, do they still make sense to us? It's not as visible because it is in a special fund versus.
But all we're talking about right now is accounting practices, essentially. We're not, I mean, it's the exact
Yes.
same thing. We're talking about accounting practices.
Yeah.
That's correct, right?
Right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You have the same policy authority no matter what bucket it's in.
It's really whatever it's called. We're talking about the name of it, right? I mean, essentially it's just the name.
We're talking about having a balance sheet, right?
Well, it's not just the name because then it affects how it's reported. So either
Right.
one way it has to be reported separately, another way, and it's not. I mean,
Correct.
it's just like legally what you have to do. So it's just legally having it so you report it all together, but physically all of the pennies are in one pile.
Yes.
Yes.
Really, to an accountant, it makes total sense.
It also makes sense to the city council member.
Okay. So, and this fund, the Special Projects Reserve, will be categorized in two ways. It'll either be categorized as assigned, meaning that the city council or the city manager has given direction to use those funds in a certain way, or committed. And this year we committed quite a few funds. They're approved with the annual budget process, so they're now committed funds. So. So the water utility fund reserves, and those are reserves that we haven't had in the past, and so that we can continue to provide high quality, dependable water service to the community, and maintain financial stability, affordability, and adequate levels of investment in infrastructure. And we did conduct a comprehensive review of the city's water utility financial plan, user classifications, and rate structures earlier this year. And with a new rate plan, 3 separate water fund reserves were proposed, and they're on this slide. And they are also part of the water rate study. So we're proposing 3 reserves for the water utility fund. One would be an operating reserve, capital reserve, and the rate stabilization reserve. And the operating reserve is to provide cash flow to support operations and maintenance of the city's water utility in the event of any significant, unanticipated, or mandated expenditures. And the level of reserve is 2 months of annual expenditures, and it is a committed GASB category. And the second one is the water utility capital reserve. And this one is to cover any unexpected and unplanned infrastructure repairs and replacements not included in the CIP budget, capital improvement budget. And the reserve level is annual average CIP expenditures averaged over the next 5 years. And it is also a committed category. And the final is a water utility fund rate stabilization reserve. And this one would be used during periods of short-term revenue shortages due to economic recession, drought, or other such causes. And it will alleviate the need to quickly implement substantial rate increases. And the calculation for that one is 10% of annual volumetric charge revenue. And it will increase 1% every year until it reaches 15% in fiscal year 22-23. And it is also a committed category. So, if we want to discuss the changes that we're proposing for the reserves, and then see where you want to go.
And also, Mayor Gramonte, maybe if there's any more questions from council, but otherwise we do need to take public comment, and then before we kind of get any initial feedback.
Is that page 10, 11? What is the proposed?
Well, the proposed change are the changes we've been talking about kind of as we generally walked through those items in red. And we can talk through each one individually when we come back and get your feedback.
I have a question. So to confirm, so at some future point, and are we going to wait? Because I know that one part of this is doing a deeper dive into former past recessions to see exactly what we needed. So is it after sort of all of the data is collected to weigh some of these decisions about thresholds, and then it'll just come back to us, and then we'll actually be like setting policy?
Yeah, and I think, but it would be good just to get a sense of council what your preference is when we're thinking about this. But yes, we would be coming back, especially in the operating reserve, and then looking at how the two interact in terms of what we think we need.
Yeah, I'm interested to see some of the numbers side of it, but also interested to see what some other cities are doing around us. And because I know that we have and then there's like also like the accounting preferred practices, just all like what is everybody doing and what are we doing?
So as far as the GASB classifications, I would say that the 90% of the cities have already adopted that classification. And actually our financial statements are already categorized that way. It is a GASB, requirement. So I would say that was something that we should probably go for and adopt now. Also,
And I find that kind of funny because we never did. It was off. I mean, it's awful. I don't understand how people here, not necessarily as we weren't around, but it was never followed. So I don't understand how there's going to be a commitment in the future if we didn't even follow it in the past.
well, best practices are, we can't change what happened in the past. We can only go forward. And so I would say that to now adopt a best practice is probably a good thing going forward. As you stated, the reserve policy, all policies, these financial reserves, the investment policy, purchasing policy, those are things that probably should be reviewed at least every 2 years, updated with council. And no, it hasn't been done in the past, but that's what we're here for. We're trying to bring best practices to.
I agree with you. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Nobody looked at it. It was supposed to be every year. So, what benchmarks will you have with respect to GASB to be able to ensure that future councils will be able to do this?
So what we will do is what we did this year with budget. So 1, the policy will be in the budget. 2, the budget will lay out the reserves and with the categories, and council should have a conversation and look at that every year as you're planning your budget.
And
So
I
that
believe,
is.
I believe that they did. I believe they did.
I
They
was
looked
not
at the
here. I
numbers
don't-
and said, oh, this is a general operating fund or something. And I guess I want more than that.
Well, I think, yeah, everyone just kind of looked at the numbers and rubber stamped it because the
Oh,
numbers
look, 2.5
didn't
million. Oh,
actually
okay.
mean anything. But, yeah, so as far as sort of like the ongoing, like, sort of updating, like, our assumptions about what 2 months would look like in terms of expenditures, which I guess will evolve as our budget evolves, but
Correct.
is, I don't know, like, how often do you go back and sort of like rethink, well, what do we actually need in
Right, well, so in this year, in the proposed budget, if you take 2 months of expenditures, it's about 17%. Probably every year, you should take a look at that. What is 2 months? Maybe it's 19%, maybe it's 20%. So you do want to take a look at that every year and 2 months of, I mean, that's really the GASB, and it's probably a best practice to have at least 2 months of reserves on hand, should you have, especially a catastrophic event, because you just don't know what's going to happen. So again, it's just every year to take a look at that.
David and then Gary.
So on personal finance, people usually should have about 6 months in reserve. And so we're looking at a 2-month reserve, 17%. I think that makes complete sense because it's, we are going to have a recession. We're already seeing lots of empty buildings popping up on the plaza and down Broadway. And I think July was a little soft for our tourism industry here. I'm all for moving towards this. I don't know. Really don't care what the council did before, but moving into these new rules and recommendations, I'll fully support this.
At this point, is there it's a suggestion now that I take it out to the public?
Yes, please.
Well, I'd like to introduce up to the public. We have a non-speaking public. I'll close that.
Well, I'll just make some comments. However, it makes it easier for accounting. I understand that. So I was just trying to figure out what the difference between the fund and all that was. But I'm sure technology has came a long way in accounting, so what makes it simple there. And going as far as the reserves, I would like to take a look at, I'm okay with 17%, but I feel like there's some members on the council that probably would like that to be lower, maybe some higher. But whenever we do have our budget, I've been impressed since I've, under the leadership of City Manager Capriola, that our budget seems to be the same every year. And one thing I would like to see is it's the same every year, and you are talking about these reserves. And if it is going high or low, it's something that is easy to see right there on the budget. So as far as the calculation, I would still be open to look and see how my colleagues feel on our next go around.
Yeah.
Well, first, thanks to Councilmember Agramani and also the staff. This has been a long time subject that she's brought up many times, and I think it's really good that we're looking at it and trying to adopt best practices. So that's great. I'm all for using best accounting practices. That sounds good. I am concerned just because the size of our cash flow, the amount of our cash flow is not that great, that perhaps we do need larger reserves percentage-wise. I think that's something we should consider. $2 million doesn't sound like very much money in the course of running this government, and I'd like to make sure that the employees are, the public too, but that the employees are protected for as long as possible if we need to figure out what to do in a economic crisis. So I would consider that. In the staff report, it talked about having regular financial reporting to the city council. That's really important to me. I talked to the city manager, and she thinks that kind of a triannual report would give us the most relevant information. And so I'd like a timeline for when we're going to start doing that. And obviously that would be the reserves, but also the just the general ledger. So that's all. Those are all my thoughts.
Assembly?
If we have to or if it'd be good for us to agree on today, it seems implementing these categories, is that something that we officially have to direct you to be able to add these categories that everyone else has been using for a long time?
Well, I think, unless there's concerns, the reality, this is the standard governmental practice, so we need to layer this over in order to be compliant, which is why our audit has already kind of moved in this direction, and now we're trying to catch up and clean up the reserve policy so it does model where we need to be with generally accepted accounting practices and the standards that are laid out for us.
Cool. And also Vice Mayor Harrington's comments about the reporting, which is not something that we've really had. So that sounds wonderful. Let's do that.
Are you talking about quarterly?
The staff report referenced quarterly financial reports to council. And when I met with the city manager today, we talked about when the data is available, and it sounds like relevant data is available about 3 times a year, and so instead of quarterly, it would be 3 times a year. That's the proposed.
Thank you.
Oh, and the last thought I had was as far as the reserves, and I think we kind of felt it last year, although it didn't actually happen. It's which months something happens makes a huge difference. Yes. So if it happened to hit us, in our winter months, it would be so much smaller than if it, came in October like it did last time. So it seems like we need to go on the more conservative side and assume that it's going to happen during our peak months.
That's a very good point. Mm-hmm.
So are we flowing with ideas? I don't. Oh, I'm sorry, David, Gary? David? You've spoken. Are we flowing with ideas?
I think so, just any of your thoughts, Mayor Gramonte, and then I think...
Is there a checklist of things you wanted us to go through, or did you just want general thoughts?
I think this is general. This was really an education, so we bring you up to speed. Here's the pieces. We can talk a little more offline to base some timing on some of the kind of more minute details and bring it back. But this is really an education. We wanted to be clear about this is where we're going, get some initial thoughts, and we'll do some more analysis and come back. But we did want to kind of get a sense of what council thought.
I think we discussed 17, 16, and 15. So would be nice to know what that might look like. And you're saying you referred to it as percentage of expenditures. Is that
Correct.
right? Rather
Correct.
than revenue. And that's how it was first designed, with revenue?
Correct. That's what the current policy says. But the standard practice most cities use is based on expenditures. And so our recommendation is we would change it to expenditures.
How long you can survive with a certain amount of expenditures is the thing that you're
Correct.
saying.
Correct.
Okay. So have you heard everything you think
I
you
think
need
so,
to
based
hear?
on the timing where we are with the regular meeting. So thank you, council, for your input, and we'll work on kind of drafting something and bring it back.
Thank you.
Thank you.